Good day, everyone. Welcome to RPI's webinar on navigating best practices in expense management with Infor XM. So without further ado, let me introduce the speakers for today. First, there is myself, Katrina Garrett. I am a senior financial consultant at RPI. And I have my compadre, my partner in crime, Rich Mitchell, who is also a senior consultant at RPI. Rich has a plethora of experience and knowledge in expense management, so I cannot wait to hear what he's going to share with us today. So, what are we going to be talking about? I'm so glad you asked. Today's agenda is what is expense management? We'll also be discussing the best practices for expense management. We're going to delve into how Infor XM makes best practices easy. We're even going to take some time and do a case study on expense management, and then we're always going to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So without further ado, Rich, help us understand what is expense management?
The simpler answer for that, Katrina, is expense management is a system to allow you to track, enforce, and process expenditures that an employee has to make directly through the system, whether it be for travel or for other check-related items that are necessary to pay a vendor. And it's really focused around the application of internal controls associated with an expense policy. Right now, back in the day when everything was paper, that was a very manual process. Today, almost everybody with any kind of cost containment process in place has gone digital with this approach. And expense management systems now proliferate the landscape for software. It's really used to control, and what it also does is it gives you the opportunity to collate data on a comparative basis so that you can look at trends. So it's really just an opportunity to pull together data more quickly, more easily, and in a more controlled fashion. XM from Infor is similar in this regard, except that they've expanded the definition a little bit into more than one application module. They basically have not only expense reports, but check requests, travel plans, which is a pre-trip authorization, and also the ability to do a timesheet in the event that you're billing out time against the project along with the expenses for that. So that's in a nutshell what really expense management is all about.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to give us that definition, Rich. So I'm sure that everyone wants to understand, why does expense management matter?
Well, I mean, one of the things that having an automated system does is it gives you a much greater control over not only the costs that are being expended, and basically that's cash out the door, but it gives you the opportunity to do that at a greater depth, meaning it allows you to control costs when times are tough. I mean, I think everybody can recall the fact that we've been through a couple of different recessions and things are a little bit unstable right now, and controlling costs becomes one of the ways of making sure that profits are still maximized where possible. And, at that point, you're looking also at reduced headcount because of the fact that business is down. And so now you want to optimize resource allocation. So expense management really does matter quite a bit in terms of making sure that those things take place.
I love the passion that you have for this. It exudes in every part of your response, Rich. So I cannot wait to hear what we're going to discuss as we start to look at the best practices for expense management.
That's a slippery slope sometimes, I have to say. Go ahead and, effectively best practices are, from any particular software vendor is going to be how they design their system to operate. And unfortunately, that is very often times the way the software vendor will position what a best practice is. But in truth, a best practice is anything that allows or helps an organization to control the financial controls necessary in a least costly fashion as possible. Right. So you're managing overhead, you're managing you're managing detection, you're managing decision making as a result of that. And in fairness, there's really three different pillars, if you will, for lack of a better word, that comprise what a best practice is. So in expense management, best practices are anything that reduces your audit risk, reduces the cost to process the expense or other documents, and it reduces the effort to actually monitor those spending practices and trends so that you can either help defray the cost by negotiating a better price or lock down a loophole. Right? So let's take a look at audit risk. What is audit risk? Well, it's not up there on the slide, but I have to tell you, audit risk is actually three different probabilities multiplied against each other. I mean, the equation is inherent risk times detection risk times control risk. And for accounting geeks like me, this is a major component of why expense management systems have gone digital. Inherent risk is essentially the natural risk associated with the transaction type. By way of example, a box of paper clips going out the door or being unaccounted for is nowhere near as much as an entire expense report going out the door in an unauthorized way. So cash going out the door is always going to have a higher risk than something that is much less expensive. And so the controls that need to be in place for that are also going to be heavier when inherent risk is higher. Control risk is all about, really it's about the ability to avoid a misstatement that could occur but not be detected because there are no internal controls to catch it. It just bypassed it, just slid right through. And detection risk is the audit procedures necessary to go back after the fact and find them. Now, in a paper-based process, detection risk is the audit function. Control risk is the actual policy that you're trying to enforce. In a digital environment, control risk is the after the fact audit and the proper identification of the violation in the application itself. And detection risk is the incorrect identification of what those violations need to be so that they're not trapped by the application.
This is a lot of great information, Rich. And I love the fact that you're pointing out it saves us from, it protects us from the money going out the door. It helps us to manage that, monitor that so that we're not losing money. So I love that audit risk piece. Another pillar that you talked about was reducing process costs. Can you go into that a little bit for the listeners?
And sure. The cost to process that, again, my accounting geek's going to come out and, think about this from a process point of view. It's like a cost accounting problem. Right? You're looking at this as everybody who touches this is going to have to spend time on it. That's a direct labor cost. Right? You've got an indirect labor cost in some of the review processes is you manually have to open it up or run a report and look at trends. You've got material costs because you've got the cost of the actual application, the subscription and things like that. You've got to also be able to process the storage necessary for the documentation that takes place, whether it's paper or it's electronic. You still have to buy someplace to put the stuff so that you can look at it later if you need to. And then on top of that, you also have overhead. Now, somebody's going to have to pay for, whether it's work from home or work in the office, you're going to have to pay for lighting, heat, computers. You have to pay for networks. You have to pay for, internet access. You need all of these things in order to do this. And this comprises a full cost. Right? In the days of paper, it started with the mailroom. Somebody had to actually manually sit there and tediously fill out an expense report, go to the photocopier if they wanted to have a copy of it and copy all their receipts and then put all those receipts onto that piece of paper and have the mail guy pick it up and bring it over to wherever it needed to go next. It was a very manual process. It was very labor intensive. It was very overhead intensive. And on top of that, you had all of the inherent risk associated with keeping check stock in the building and issuing a check for somebody's expenses. Right? So those things have ridiculously skyrocketed costs, And even in a digital environment where you have folks who have taken that approach and they've said, okay, we're just going to do this electronically, but they're still doing 100% audit. They still want a paper receipt for everything as an image. That still contains a higher cost, if you will, to process, because somebody's got to look at it and then you've got to store it. So, I mean, there's a process cost here that if you take the time to do a good design, it will actually allow you to reduce that process by only looking at the things that really need to be looked at, as opposed to looking at everything just in case. Right? And that's part of the mental mindset shift that most expense reporting solutions need to drive into an organization that adopts them.
So, Rich, when you talk
Next.
about putting on your financial geek cap, I just want you to know that I share that cap with you. And I was just reminiscing of the days that I had to go in and manually write out those expense reports. So I am very thankful for us automating processes. And no, I don't even have a copier machine. So I'm very thankful that I can just scan my images.
Yeah.
All right. So
I was part of an internal audit team where, you know, you weren't allowed to use whiteout. You made one mistake in cross-footing, you had to start over, you know, and at the bottom of the expense report, starting over because of that. Oh,
okay. So let's stick with the pillars. So you've already talked about the audit risk. We're going through the reduced process costs. And there was another pillar that you mentioned, which is the reducing time to analyze the spend. Could you expound upon that?
Sure. Time to spend is really compiling all that data together. Now, I mean, in the old days, before you had a dedicated system for this, someone would process this as an accounts payable transaction. It would go in, it would hit a general ledger account. And depending on how they wanted to break it apart, you know, it might hit more than one account and that's it. I mean, you had no indication as to who the vendor was, what the spend was for. I went on this trip, but you might be hitting 5 different accounts for that trip. And hey, you know, nobody's going to take a look at it. They just want to know, are you within budget? And that's problematic, really, because there are things out there that would allow you to do a better job. I mean, travel management applications were intended to kind of capture the travel spend area, but they never really had a full link into the expense management side of things. And now, with expense management doing what it's doing on an automated basis, you now have the ability to sit down and say, wait a minute, why am I spending so much money on these vendors? You know, I mean, a classic example of this was one of my very first implementations in expense management was for a very large chemical company that had globally deployed the application, had never really pulled global content together. And they sat down and they went through a conversion from one electronic system to another, and suddenly realized the power that they had at their fingertips. And they turned around and they started doing analysis. And after all the low-hanging fruit for, you know, things like hotel rates and, other benefits for airfare and things like that came out and got dealt with, they finally come up with, hey, why are we spending so much money at the airport? You know, they literally had a parking cost in one location for one vendor that was $800,000 a year. And because their travelers were going so often to different locations, what they were doing was they were parking in short-term parking. And they were paying full freight on a weeks-long trip, which, as you know, can climb up pretty high in any major airport. So they turned around and they went to the airport and they said, hey, look, you know, we're going to forbid our employees from ever parking in your airport again. They're going to have to go off-site or catch a ride into the airport. We're just paying you too much money for this. And what they wound up doing was negotiating a discounted long-term rate no matter where the employee parked. And that cut their cost from 800,000 plus down to 250,000 thereabouts on an annual basis. That's a pretty significant saving. And it's only available when you have analysis that's available using modern business intelligence tools that can look at the data, pull it together, say, this makes no sense. What's this about? And then dive into it and do some drill down.
When I listen to this, I'm just reminded of back in the day where, you know, the expense system was separate from your GL system. And so you couldn't do the analysis to that level, or you had to, the reporting in that system was different. And You just had to finagle the data to get to the analysis, to look at the data the way you needed to see it. You had to do a lot of work to get into that format. So I love how it's connecting and minimizing that time, because from an accounting perspective, we don't want to spend a lot of time looking, trying to figure out what happened. We want to be able to quickly and analyze and assess the data and keep on moving, because there's a lot of work to get done, right?
You know, I can remember the day when we had dozens of analysts sit there trying to pore over this, and you know, some poor accountant was sitting to do account analyses, just trying to figure out what was in there and do a summary for somebody. When you know, it could all be done remotely by just running a report. You know, this is a significant improvement, and expense management systems provide that capability.
So here goes the $1,000,000 question, Rich. Okay. You've gone over the pillars.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can we delve into how does Infor XM help? Because I know that's what everybody's wondering. Like, what makes this tool so special? What sets it apart?
You know, the benefit that Infor XM does is in one instance, in a complete application, you can deploy this globally, and it will support all the languages, all of the unique cultural requirements for each country, all of the configuration requirements, the specialized configuration necessary for certain areas or certain types of business that you're working on. It could be just a business line. And it will do all of that in one single instance. Infor themselves have deployed this application across 60,000 users in 40 different countries. Each one of them has their own language. Each one of them has their own business rules, their own workflow, review process. All of those things are available within Infor. And it is a very, very, very flexible application. So one of the things it will do is it'll avoid the complexity of having multiple systems come together and then have that all consolidated into a single data lake. Now you've got it all in one application, and it can pull it together for you. And then the analysis of expense management areas that you need to delve into for a given business unit are now much more readily available as a result.
So taking that a little deeper, Rich, and let's go into the case study, like looking at how it addresses the challenges from an operation perspective.
Okay, so let me tell you another one where it was a separate or a different, I should say, chemical company. They were relatively famous on the East Coast, but not a lot of people knew them, but they knew their products. And they had a process where they were basically running manual spreadsheets into an email process, and then they were loading that up, and then they would send the email with the expense report as a spreadsheet, but there was no control over what went on that spreadsheet. And the back office would get the email and then wait for the receipt package to come in and then try to match that to the email, and then sit there and manually pour over everything. So, you know, effectively, that became a problem and a bottleneck. And, you know, the person that I was dealing with on that design feature, you know, essentially said, I have a process that works. You know, why do I need to change this? You know, they didn't really feel like they were doing something that was actually necessary. And I said, well, how long does it take you to process an expense report? And it goes, well, somewhere between 3 to 4 weeks. And I said, really? 3 to 4 weeks of overhead? You know, you're going to accrue all of that into the cost of this. So go ahead and give me that next slide, because here's what we did in terms of alleviating their problem. We turned around, and as part of the design, we built an exception-based workflow activity process. And that basically means that when you submitted an expense report, an entire set of business rules went into the design that said, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, this is okay if somebody approves it. All right. And in those scenarios, when you have that, you can identify what the violations are and whether or not you're going to reimburse for it. If you're going to reimburse for it, but you need somebody to look at it, then you can turn around and say, this is a violation. I need you to say why this violation took place and whether or not this is acceptable. And in doing that, what wound up happening was that you captured the approval process for the things that mattered. And what you really did was you took the 80% of the population that did not need a detailed review and allowed that to flow through the system. and the 20% that required a much deeper review because they were 80% of your audit risk got stopped and looked at. Right? And as a result of that, it changed the workflow process. And, we also took and looked at best practice for receipts. Now, most people don't really appreciate this, and there are some companies that are always going to be a little uncomfortable with it. But believe it or not, in the US, for the IRS, a paper receipt is not required for $75 or less if it's coming in from a credit card feed, unless it's for a hotel. And the only reason that that's an exception is because they need to be able to see whether or not there's entertainment and or meal expense inside the hotel folio charge, and because they get deducted at a lower rate. They want to make sure that the accounting is okay for that, and that's a reasonable exception to deal with from a process point of view. So effectively, we built a design that streamlined their entire process. Go ahead and give me the results of that. It's pretty impressive. So we took the review steps from 10 down to 1.06 reviewers, right? And the exceptions there were pretty exceptional because, in some cases, if it was the CEO, it had to actually go to an internal auditor who then had to report up to the board of directors for every expense report that person put through. They were very conscientious of the fact that, upper management could take advantage of things that they shouldn't. And their C-level review was, believe it or not, really outstanding. And what we automated that, it just took a lot of the load out of the ordinary accounts payable folks who then had to reset where that document went. And we also were able to get the number of audited expense reports from 100% down to 25%. That allowed a reimbursement in the first year, that allowed a reimbursement of 60% or more of the submitted expense reports to be processed in 4 days. Right? That was huge, from 3 to 4 weeks, 4 days to get 60% of your expense reports out. And the only ones that were really holding that up were the ones with exceptions. And within 8 days, 80% of expense reports were through the system completely. Within the second year, that dropped even further. We got to 80% on the second year that were done in 4 days, simply because people now became accustomed to what the policy was based on the way the business rules fired. And so they just learned to modify their behavior as a result of that. On top of that, by putting in the corporate card into the system, they were able to document their spend, and they got a cash rebate back from the amount of spend that they were doing on travel. Most corporate cards are driven by banks. Banks are looking at the amount of time it takes to get reimbursed, and that makes a big difference. Go ahead.
Well, let me just say this. So not only did you give money back through the rebates, so money was returned, but also your FTEs, their time in putting through transactions was greatly reduced. So now they're not spending their time looking at the transactions, processing through the system. They're more doing review analysis, and they have time to do other things to dig deeper into the data. That is amazing results, Rich. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Rich.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Can you hear me now? Okay. It's impressive when you do the design work, and when the company is willing to take a chance in changing their process. A lot of companies, when they're coming out of paper or when they're coming out of a very antiquated review process, they're just not comfortable letting go of that control. And the problem is that they don't understand that control is replaced with a different electronic control, and that allows them to review the operation of those controls versus actually becoming the control themselves. All right, so it becomes a pretty significant improvement in the way things are managed, if you will.
Okay, this is good stuff, Rich. So now the next question is, how do we get help? Like, for those that are watching, how do you get help with expense management?
Well, first you engage RPI. No, really. It's the expense management application by Infor is actually very, very thoroughly, I want to say, flexible. We had a lot of big names, or Infor had a lot of big names associated with this application in the early days of the 90s. It went through a really big evolution in terms of the application's strengths. We've added a lot of it. They added a lot of features to the fact that this product needed to be flexible for, believe it or not, a variety of different approaches to how to handle expenses internally. You know, the one comment that I always laughed a bit about was customers would come up and say, we're just like everybody else. We just do expenses. And then when you get into it and talk about how their policy was enforced and what their policy was, there was maybe a 40% overlap from company to company, and everybody else was, you know, there was a 60% variation. Infor Expense Management allows you to deal with that variation, and it allows you to deal with it at a level that most organizations don't today in terms of, you know, expense management processing. They're simplistic. They just simply automate the putting in of the data, if you will. They don't necessarily give you the ability to build separate controls for different business units and find a way to navigate through a workflow engine to assign the approval process the way it should be approved. So that being said, you also have the ability to leverage corporate data. By that, I mean you can set up a check request process and import your vendors from your accounts payable master into the application. You can import users from your HR system or from your AP system. Those things are available. Time tracking allows you to set up spend against hours in a project. Right? So you can turn around and track not only your expenses on a project, or also your time spent on that project. And that gives you a better feel for the overall cost against that project. If it's an internal capital project, that's significant, because now you've got the ability to leverage what the actual cost of that building improvement was versus the other way around, where you're sitting there and guessing at it because you don't know exactly how many hours you spent on it. And if you're in a consulting organization like we are, then this becomes really neat, because I can set up a billable project in the system, assign a user to it, and then associate the expenses that they put in on their travel to that project, and then put that into whatever invoicing process you've got. So Infor Expense Management provides a lot of flexibility for a lot of different things. And one of the things that we provide is the expertise in how to manage and best design that process so that they can leverage it the best way.
This is a lot of great information, Rich. And I mean, it is overwhelmingly evident that you are the guru in XM from a financial perspective and in how to utilize the tool. So I thank you for just taking the time to walk us through this process and help us understand how this tool would be a benefit to anyone who is in the application, and how it can help optimize their processes, help reduce audit risk, help to opportunities for rebates. I mean, this has been but this is the thing that gets me, the part about we have to relinquish control. I think that's the hardest thing for a finance person, is to relinquish control, but to build out the tool in such a way that we can relinquish control so that we can better optimize our processes. I think that is just phenomenal. So without further ado, that brings us to the end of our slide, and we're going to enter into Q&A. So if anyone's watching and you're catching the replay, if you want more information, we invite you to email us, either Rich or myself. Contact us with any questions, but I do feel like we got a few questions from a few viewers. So I want to just call out some of those questions for you, Rich, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One question is, what options does Infor XM provide for greater accessibility?
So from about, I want to say about 2005 thereabouts, Infor XM actually provided a mobile app. The original mobile app was a generic one, would work with just about any device, and it's still out there actually on the various libraries that the mobile service providers give out. But right now they've got a newer one out there. It requires a later version of XM. It actually only works with expense reporting at the moment, but it's tied into the email process. It's tied into it's also tied into character recognition. So if OCR is enabled inside XM, it will allow the receipt image to go into a particular user profile and or expense report to either generate the expense report or to actually just sit there and wait for it to pull into an expense report and then generate the line item that needs to be there. So all of that capability is there today. They haven't really said whether or not they're going to extend it beyond expense reports. The older one actually did timesheets, but right now timesheets is not nearly as popular as the expense report and travel plans modules are today, particularly within healthcare and in public sector. Right, so those are areas that Infor is looking at, but they definitely have support for iPhone and Android today to allow that to take place.
Great. Okay, so I have a second question. I'll tell you, the folks are really anxious to hear about this. One question, the second question is, how does Infor XM integrate with other applications?
Good question. Infor XM originally was built with a set of staging tables, and essentially you could pull data out of and push data into XM using traditional database techniques from ASCII data. And it was easily the more complex part of every implementation that was done prior to going into the multi-tenant cloud world. And it existed in multi-tenant still today for quite a long time. But as time progressed, beginning around 2012, 2013, Infor built their own middleware, and they call that ION. And right now, between the various ERP systems and other applications that Infor provides as part of its suite of applications, ION allows connecting XM to pretty much most of them. So we have standard connectors that allow Infor to receive corporate data and user information, and then to pass out expense report and other document data like payment requests and travel plan data. That capability of flowing that data back and forth exists between their major ERP support teams. And technically speaking, it's mostly focused on the multi-tenant environment today, but it actually exists as a standalone on-premise deployment as well. You can use their middleware to connect other applications outside of the suite of applications that Infor provides and actually make that middleware connect to XM as well. And I'm sure that there are a couple of customers out there that are doing that today. I mean, we still do have some on-premise customers, so that's usually a very positive thing for most of the customers looking at the application from an integration.
Great information, great feedback. In the interest of time, we're going to go and answer one. We have one more question that I'm going to ask, and all other questions, please feel free to email us to respond. But the last question we're going to go over is this, Rich. Are you ready? Because this is a big one. The question is, can you elaborate on how Infor XM effectively handles multiple countries within one application instance, including individual configurations and language support? And are there any challenges to be aware of in this setup? That was a lot.
Okay. So first, let me hit the first part of that. The application supports multi-currency, multi-country, and it does that in multiple areas. So a classic example is language. It comes with a full translation for the base application across 40 countries. And the way it's set up, you can actually add another language relatively easily, or you can adjust the phrasing of something if it's not colloquially a correct interpretation of the way that should be described. So there's definitely a capability there for international, both from a currency point of view and from a language point of view. A couple other things for multi-global, I said multinational global deployment. There's a per diem engine inside the application. It not only handles US government per diems, meaning that it automatically loads that, but we have countries that use per diems for the Germanic countries, or particularly, and the Scandinavian ones as well, use per diems heavily. And they have some very, very complex rules about what that per diem is. It's tied to the location of the expense. And when you put the expense in with the location, it automatically will calculate the per diem based on the rules that you define for that per diem. And you can actually define a per diem expense type with those rules for each country that you're deploying to, and then isolate it using a group structure. So depending on the nature of the company and how complex they want to deal with this, they can actually set up individual groups of users and or business rules and or other corporate data that are specific to a particular location or business line or both inside any part of an organization. So Infor does it by country. You can do it, US, Canada, Japan, China, Germany, Norway, whatever, Russia, and it will support double byte languages as well. So all of that capability exists. And then you can set it up with those groups so that the administrators for each one of those areas only see the data that they have permission to using that group permission capability. The really cool thing is that the rates are loaded automatically. For the US, the per diem rates are loaded automatically. For Europe, per diems are not available in an electronic format, so that's still a manual effort. And on top of that, we have something called VAT tax in most of the world outside of the US. Canada uses something called GST and PST along with a harmonized HST tax. And those require separate accounting because they're different percentages. But a lot of times companies would prefer to have those accounting amounts split out for the taxes to make the audit process easier. And actually, we have an engine inside Infor XM that does that. It will actually let you split post the accounting. So the actual expense goes in total. The user doesn't touch it, but behind the scenes, the system figures out the location, the VAT percentage, whether it's reclaimable or not, puts it in the appropriate account and splits out the components of it so that when they go to do the audits, they know exactly where it came from, what the expense was for, but they're only focused on the tax for that. Right. So instead of looking at the actual total and trying to figure out whether they paid the appropriate amount of tax, the amount of tax is right there. And all of that is very easily navigated from an analysis point of view. So from a practical point of view, Infor Expense Management is one of the few applications out there on the market today that'll let you do all of this capability one instance, just one implementation totally. And then naturally, how do you want to avoid the complications? Well, let me tell you that if you're going to go global in a large organization like that, my recommendation is not to go big bang. You want to do them one country at a time, one business unit at a time. Sit up and take the time to understand what each one of the requirements are and get all of the input necessary, all of the information necessary to do this, all of the connection points necessary to do this, and then organize that because it's going to all come in and flow through one process. Right? And that allows you to make a much more informed and easier change management process to get this deployed internationally. And if it's done right, and once it's stabilized, it becomes a much easier system to maintain because you've sort of decentralized the administration, but you don't actually have to worry about having 5 different systems on different versions at the same time. It's all on the same version. It's all in the same place. It's all running at the same time. So from a practical point of view, the things that you need to really consider are that the more complex the integration requirements are, the longer the implementation is going to take. So you need to think about what's upstream from the data that's going to come into XM, and what are the sources going to be, how do I plan out my integration, and how do I make this more effective from a streamlined point of view. It's not just about who gets to do the approvals, it's also where's the data coming from, how reliable is the process to bring that data in.
Awesome. This is great. This has been a great discussion, Rich. Appreciate your time. And I know we can go on and on about expense management and the benefits of using this tool, but we have to wrap it up. So to our audience that took the time to watch this webinar, I hope that you found this information something that you can build upon, something that would pique your interest and even come and utilize the tool to support your organizational needs. So we thank you for attending. And again, if you have any further questions, please email Rich or myself. Have a great day, everyone.